I realized my home was gone when my son raised his glass and smiled like he was delivering good news. The Thanksgiving turkey was still steaming in the center of the table, the smell of sage and butter filling the dining room I had polished with my own hands that morning. Candles flickered gently, reflected in the china I had saved for over 40 years, and outside the tall windows the late November wind rattled the last golden leaves from the maple tree Thomas and I had planted when Daniel was just 5 years old. "Mom," he said, his voice bright and confident, the same voice that once asked me to check for monsters under his bed. "This is your last holiday in this house. We sold it." For a moment I thought I had misheard him, that the words had tangled themselves somewhere between the clink of silverware and the distant hum of a passing truck on Cedar Lane. I kept smiling. I had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than tears. Rebecca reached across the table and adjusted the sleeve of her cream-colored sweater, her manicured nails catching the candlelight like small, sharp signals. She did not look surprised. In fact, she looked relieved, as if a long-awaited performance had finally begun. Around us, the grandchildren continued passing mashed potatoes and cranberry sauce, unaware that the ground beneath their holiday traditions had just shifted forever. I placed my napkin neatly beside my plate, careful not to let my hands tremble. The mahogany table felt suddenly unfamiliar, as though it belonged to someone else, someone who had never spent decades hosting birthday dinners and Christmas mornings within these walls. "I see," I said softly, my voice steady enough to surprise even myself. Daniel nodded quickly, mistaking my calm for agreement. He launched into an explanation about market timing, rising property taxes, and how the new owners were a young couple eager to renovate. Words like investment and opportunity floated across the room like cold drafts. Rebecca laughed lightly at something he said, her laughter practiced, polished, and entirely out of place. I noticed then that the framed photograph of Thomas and me, the one that always stood on the sideboard during holidays, was missing. In its place sat a decorative bowl I had never seen before. A small detail, a quiet clue, the kind that would have meant nothing to anyone else. But I had spent 72 years learning how to read the silences between people. I reached for my water glass and took a slow sip, letting the coolness anchor me while memories flickered behind my eyes. 3 mornings earlier I had walked into the study to find the file cabinet locked. 2 nights ago I had heard Rebecca whispering into her phone on the back porch, her voice sharp and urgent until she noticed me standing in the doorway. Yesterday the hallway closet had smelled faintly of cardboard and packing tape. I had told myself it was nothing. That grief had made me suspicious. That families sometimes drifted without meaning to. Now, as Daniel continued describing their plans to expand their business in Raleigh, I understood that nothing about this was accidental. They had been preparing for my disappearance with the same careful efficiency I once used to plan school lunches and piano recitals. Outside, a car door slammed. The sound echoed through the house like punctuation. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw not the boy who used to hold my hand crossing the street, but a stranger who had already moved on from the life that had shaped him. His eyes slid away from mine, settling instead on Rebecca's approving smile. That was when I felt it, a shift so subtle it might have been mistaken for resignation. But it was not resignation. It was clarity. The kind that arrives after a long winter when you finally realize the cold was never temporary. I folded my hands in my lap and listened as they discussed timelines, legal documents, and the convenience of senior living communities with heated pools and weekly shuttle service. Their concerns sounded generous. Their intentions sounded practical. Yet beneath every polite sentence ran a current of quiet dismissal, as if I had already become a guest in the story of my own life. I glanced toward the window where the maple branches scraped softly against the glass, reminding me that roots run deeper than walls. They believed they had taken my home. They believed I would pack my memories into boxes and disappear with gratitude. I let them believe it. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing an old woman can do is smile and say nothing at all. The house felt different after they left. That night, not empty but hollow in a way that echoed with every step, I took across the hardwood floors. Thomas had refinished himself one summer when money was tight and hope was something we still measured in small victories. The candles had burned down into soft puddles of wax, the turkey sat untouched in the oven, and the good china waited patiently on the table as if the evening might rewind itself and begin again with laughter instead of polite cruelty. I moved slowly through each room, turning off lights one by one, noticing details that had never seemed important before. The hallway mirror had been angled slightly toward the front door, as though someone had needed to watch arrivals and departures. The coat closet, once crowded with winter jackets and forgotten umbrellas, now held only my faded blue parka and an unfamiliar stack of flattened moving boxes tied together with twine. I touched them with the tips of my fingers, feeling the rough edges catch against my skin. They had been preparing for weeks, maybe months. I wondered how many conversations had taken place just beyond my hearing. How many plans had been finalized while I watered the geraniums or folded laundry that no one else would ever wear. Outside, a late November drizzle began to tap softly against the kitchen window, turning the world beyond the glass into a watercolor of gray streets and distant porch lights. I poured myself a cup of coffee even though it was well past 9 o'clock at night, craving the bitter steadiness of something familiar. The clock above the refrigerator ticked loudly, each second stretching into something heavier than time. 3 days earlier I had opened the drawer where we kept family photographs and found half of them missing. I told myself Daniel must have borrowed them for a project or a surprise. Rebecca had smiled too quickly when I asked, her answer smooth as polished marble. Yesterday morning I had walked down to the basement to search for the extra tablecloth, and discovered neat rows of labeled bins lined against the far wall. Colin's residence, living room, kitchen, master suite. My name was written in black marker on a smaller box set apart from the rest, as though I were an item that required special handling. I had stood there for a long moment, listening to the low hum of the furnace, feeling something inside me tighten like a knot pulled too far. That afternoon Daniel had called to confirm dinner, his voice warm, almost affectionate, as if rehearsing the role he would play. Now the performance was over. I carried my coffee into the study and sat in Thomas' chair, the leather still creaking in the same familiar protest. The desk drawers had been cleared of most of his papers, leaving behind only a few yellowed envelopes and the faint scent of cedar polish. On the corner of the blotter rested a business card I did not recognize. A real estate firm from downtown. The edges were worn, as though it had been handled often. I turned it over slowly, reading the agent name in the lamplight, and felt that quiet shift again, the one that replaced hurt with something colder and far more useful. They believed they had orchestrated everything perfectly, that my grief had made me blind and my age had made me weak. I sipped my coffee and listened to the rain gather strength, imagining the moving trucks they must have already scheduled, the polite strangers who would soon walk through these rooms measuring walls and discussing paint colors. Somewhere upstairs a floorboard creaked as the house settled into the night, a sound that once meant comfort and now sounded like a warning. I stood and walked toward the front window, watching headlights sweep across the empty street before disappearing into darkness. For the first time since Thomas died, I did not feel alone. I felt awake. The kind of awake that comes when the truth finally steps into the light and refuses to be ignored. The next morning arrived with a pale winter sun that barely warmed the frost clinging to the edges of the porch railings, and I found myself awake long before the alarm clock had any chance to sound. Habit perhaps. Or the quiet understanding that life as I had known it was already dissolving around me. I dressed carefully in a wool cardigan Thomas had given me years ago, smoothing the sleeves as though composure could be stitched into fabric. The kitchen still smelled faintly of roasted turkey and cinnamon from the pie that no one had finished, and I stood there for several minutes staring at the sink full of dishes, wondering how something so ordinary could suddenly feel like evidence from a crime I had not known was being committed. I began washing each plate by hand, not because the dishwasher was broken, but because the rhythm steadied my thoughts. Water ran warm over my fingers. Porcelain clicked softly against porcelain. Outside, the neighborhood moved through its usual routines. A school bus groaned to a stop at the corner. A golden retriever barked somewhere down the block. Life, it seemed, had not received the memo that my world had been quietly auctioned off. By mid-morning I found myself driving downtown, the familiar route lined with bare oak trees and storefronts already decorated for Christmas. I did not remember deciding to leave the house. My hands simply turned the steering wheel, guided by instinct stronger than hesitation. The real estate office sat between a bakery and a dry cleaner, its wide glass windows displaying glossy photographs of homes with perfect lawns and staged living rooms. I paused on the sidewalk studying my reflection in the glass. A 72-year-old woman with silver hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck. A woman who had hosted fundraisers and piano recitals and countless holiday dinners. A woman who had apparently been relocated without consultation. Inside, the air smelled faintly of fresh carpet and brewed coffee. A young receptionist greeted me with professional cheerfulness that faltered when I gave my name. I watched recognition dawn in her eyes like the slow spread of dawn over a frozen field. She excused herself and disappeared into a back office, leaving me alone with the framed floor plans and brochures promising new beginnings. When the agent finally emerged, he carried a folder too thick to be anything but significant. He spoke gently, using phrases like market value and signed agreement and expedited closing. I listened without interrupting, the way I used to listen to Daniel recite his spelling words, offering encouragement with my silence. He showed me copies of documents bearing my signature, signatures that looked almost like mine if you did not know the small hesitation in the curve of my M, or the way my hand always pressed harder at the end of my last name. A power of attorney form dated 6 months earlier. Authorization to list and sell the property. Consent to vacate within 30 days. I traced the ink with one finger, feeling neither anger nor disbelief. Only a growing sense of distance from the life that had once fit me so comfortably. Your son said you were aware, the agent added carefully. I nodded as though the explanation satisfied me, though inside something colder than grief was taking shape. On the drive home I stopped at the grocery store out of habit and bought a loaf of whole wheat bread and a quart of milk, items that felt absurdly small against the scale of what had been taken. The cashier wished me a happy holiday. I thanked her. Back in the car I sat for several minutes watching shoppers load their trunks with wrapped gifts and poinsettias, the ordinary choreography of December continuing without pause. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house stood exactly as I had left it, windows reflecting the gray afternoon sky, curtains drawn with the same quiet dignity they had always held. Yet I could not shake the feeling that I was already visiting a place that no longer belonged to me. I carried the groceries inside and set them on the counter, listening to the echo of my footsteps travel down the hallway like a question that had yet to be answered. That evening I opened the old cedar chest at the foot of my bed, the one Thomas had insisted we keep even when fashion declared such things outdated, and I began lifting out the quiet history of a life I had once believed was permanent. Wool blankets folded with military precision. A stack of yellowed Christmas cards tied together with a faded blue ribbon. The deed to the property, or what I had always thought was the deed, resting inside a cracked leather folder whose corners had softened with decades of careful handling. I sat on the edge of the mattress and let my fingers move slowly across the embossed letters of Thomas' name, remembering the day we signed those papers in a small office that smelled of dust and determination. We had not owned much then. A used pickup truck. A set of mismatched dishes. Dreams that measured wider than the 10 acres of rolling land we could barely afford. Thomas had squeezed my hand as though sealing a promise that no one else would ever have the power to break. The memory warmed me for exactly 3 heartbeats before the present returned with its sharper edges. Downstairs the furnace clicked on with a mechanical sigh. Somewhere outside, a dog barked once and fell silent. I rose and carried the folder into the study, setting it beside the documents I had brought home from the real estate office earlier that afternoon. Under the lamplight the differences were subtle but undeniable. Dates that did not align. Legal language that shifted tone halfway through a paragraph. Signatures that imitated mine but lacked the small stubborn flourish I had added ever since high school. I poured myself a glass of water and drank it slowly, feeling the cool clarity spread through my chest. They had not simply arranged my departure. They had rewritten the story of ownership itself. For years I had believed Rebecca's influence over Daniel was the ordinary kind that grows between married people. A gradual weaving of priorities and preferences that eventually leaves parents standing politely at the edges. Now I saw the pattern with unsettling precision. Holiday visits shortened. Phone calls postponed. Traditions replaced by new rituals that did not require my presence. I remembered the Thanksgiving 2 years ago when she suggested we order takeout instead of cooking together. Her laugh bright as she claimed it would be less stressful for everyone. Daniel had agreed too quickly. The following spring she had convinced him to refinance the house, citing market conditions I did not fully understand. He had asked me to sign a stack of papers at the kitchen table, assuring me it was routine. I had trusted him the way only a mother can, believing that love itself functioned as a kind of legal protection. The realization that trust had been used as a tool rather than honored as a gift settled over me like the first true snowfall of winter, quiet and irreversible. I turned toward the bookshelf where Thomas had kept his journals, each volume labeled with careful dates. He had been a man who believed in documentation, in leaving behind a trail of clarity for those who came after him. I pulled one down at random and opened to a page filled with his precise handwriting. Notes about land surveys. References to a separate trust he had mentioned only once, late at night when illness had begun to shadow his voice. At the time I had dismissed it as another of his practical obsessions. Now the words glowed with new significance. Outside, headlights swept across the ceiling as a car passed on the road, then vanished. I closed the journal gently and returned it to its place, feeling that same cold steadiness take root once more. They believed I was unraveling. They believed the woman who had managed budgets and crises and heartbreak for more than 7 decades would simply fold into whatever future they had chosen for her. I stood there in the quiet study, surrounded by the faint scent of cedar and ink, and understood with absolute certainty that they had mistaken my silence for surrender. The difference between the two would soon become very clear. The following morning I woke before dawn, the sky outside still a deep slate blue that made the world feel suspended between endings and beginnings, and for several minutes I lay perfectly still listening to the quiet pulse of the house around me. Pipes ticking, wind pressing gently against the siding, the faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall. These sounds had once meant safety. Now they sounded like reminders that time was moving forward whether I was ready or not. I rose slowly, wrapping Thomas' old robe around my shoulders, and walked barefoot across the cool wooden floor toward the study where the journals waited like patient witnesses. A thin line of frost traced the inside corners of the window panes, and when I touched the glass with my fingertips it felt like placing my hand against the surface of a truth that could no longer be softened. I made coffee the way I always had, measuring the grounds carefully, letting the machine gurgle and sigh as though sharing my fatigue. The first sip was bitter enough to make my eyes water. I welcomed the sensation. It grounded me in a morning that demanded clarity. On the kitchen counter lay the business card from the real estate agent, its edges curling slightly as though even paper could feel the strain of what had been set in motion. Beside it I placed the worn leather folder containing Thomas' notes about the land trust he had once mentioned in passing, his voice hoarse with illness but firm with intention. At the time I had nodded politely, believing there would be years to revisit such details. Years we never received. I sat at the table and began reading again, this time not as a grieving widow searching for comfort, but as a woman assembling pieces of a puzzle she had been forced to solve alone. References to survey lines that extended beyond the visible fences. Mentions of mineral rights and conservation easements. A handwritten reminder circled twice in red ink. Never transfer ownership of the land itself. I felt something inside me steady, like a compass needle finally aligning after a long season of spinning. The house they had sold stood on property Thomas had protected with a stubborn foresight I had once teased him for. If his notes were accurate, the structure could change hands but the ground beneath it remained tied to a separate trust that required my consent for any permanent alteration. I set the journal down carefully and allowed myself a single quiet breath of something that might have been relief. It was not victory. Not yet. But it was the first indication that the story Daniel and Rebecca believed they had completed still contained unwritten chapters. Later that afternoon I drove to the county records office, the low brick building smelling faintly of dust and floor polish, and requested copies of every document associated with our property. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a name badge that read Lorraine, guided me through the process with the calm efficiency of someone who understood that paper trails often revealed more than people intended. We spread the pages across a long wooden table under fluorescent lights that hummed like distant insects. Line by line, date by date, the truth emerged in quiet increments. The sale agreement referenced only the residence and immediate fixtures. The land trust remained intact, untouched by the signatures that had been used to move me out of my own life. I thanked Lorraine and gathered the documents into my purse, feeling their weight settle against my side like a promise. Outside, the afternoon sun had broken through the clouds, casting sharp winter shadows across the parking lot. I stood there for a moment letting the light warm my face, aware that grief had not left me but had been joined by something stronger. Resolve. They believed they had taken everything that mattered. They had not yet realized how much of this story still belonged to me. Snow began falling that evening in thin, uncertain flakes that disappeared the moment they touched the still warm pavement, and I stood at the front window watching the streetlights glow softly through the gathering dusk, feeling as though the entire neighborhood had slipped into a slower rhythm that matched the quiet determination growing inside me. I had placed the copies of the county records neatly on the dining room table where holiday place settings had once stood, aligning each page with the precision of someone who understood that order itself could be a form of resistance. The land trust document rested at the top of the stack, its language dense and formal, yet more comforting than any sympathetic word Daniel had offered in recent months. I read it again, tracing the clause that required my written consent before any structural alteration, subdivision, or long-term leasing could occur. They could change the curtains. They could repaint the walls. They could even move in their carefully chosen furniture. But the ground beneath their ambition still answered to me. The realization did not bring immediate joy. It brought clarity. I turned off the overhead lights and left only the small lamp glowing near the staircase, allowing shadows to stretch across the hallway like quiet witnesses. In that softened light, the house felt less like something I was about to lose and more like a partner in a strategy neither Daniel nor Rebecca had considered. I began moving through each room with deliberate calm, opening drawers and closets not to pack but to observe. In the guest bedroom, I found a list taped inside the wardrobe door detailing future renovations in Rebecca-precise handwriting. Kitchen island expansion. Master suite conversion. Backyard entertainment deck. Each item marked with estimated square footage and projected resale value. I smiled then, not from amusement but from recognition. She had never loved this house. She had only loved what it could become once I was removed from the equation. Downstairs, the grandfather clock chimed 7 slow notes, echoing through the empty spaces like a countdown. I sat at the dining table and opened Thomas' final journal once more, rereading passages I had skimmed in my earlier shock. There, between notes about property lines and tax assessments, he had written something more personal. Margaret must never feel she has nowhere to stand. The sentence was simple, almost careless in its placement, yet it carried the weight of a man who had always planned 3 steps ahead. I pressed my palm flat against the page, feeling as though his steady presence had returned for just a moment to remind me who I had always been before grief made me doubt my own strength. Later that night, my phone vibrated softly on the kitchen counter. A message from Daniel appeared on the screen, polite and practical, asking whether I had begun sorting my belongings and reminding me that the buyers would conduct a preliminary walkthrough in 2 weeks. I read his words twice, noticing how efficiently he had transformed a lifetime into a logistical inconvenience. I typed a brief reply assuring him everything was under control. The truth of that statement settled over me like a cloak I had finally chosen to wear. Outside, the snowfall thickened, covering tire tracks and footprints alike, smoothing the world into something deceptively peaceful. I poured a cup of tea and carried it to the back porch, stepping into the cold air without hesitation. The land stretched out beyond the fence line, dark and silent, its boundaries invisible yet unbroken. Somewhere beneath the frozen soil lay the foundation of every memory we had built here. They believed ownership could be transferred with a signature. They had not yet understood that some things require permission written in far deeper ink. The days that followed moved with a strange combination of urgency and stillness, as if time itself had decided to watch rather than interfere. And I began waking earlier than ever before, often before the first delivery truck rolled down Cedar Lane or the neighbor across the street flicked on his porch light. I developed a routine that looked from the outside like preparation for departure. Cardboard boxes appeared in the hallway. Old magazines were tied into neat stacks. Drawers were emptied with methodical care. Anyone observing would have believed I was surrendering to the inevitable. That belief became part of my strategy. I left one box deliberately open near the front door, filled with folded sweaters and framed photographs whose absence would be noticeable but not alarming. Rebecca noticed, of course. She arrived one afternoon with an expression that hovered between sympathy and triumph, her boots leaving damp impressions on the welcome mat. She spoke softly about how difficult transitions could be, and how wonderful the senior apartment she had researched would look once I added personal touches. I listened, nodding politely. offering her tea in the same chipped porcelain cup she had once declared too outdated for modern taste. While she spoke, I watched her eyes travel around the room, measuring walls and windows with quiet calculation. She did not realize I had already memorized every inch of the renovation list she had hidden in the wardrobe. She did not realize the land beneath her imagined deck remained beyond her reach. After she left, I carried the tea tray into the kitchen and allowed myself a single long exhale, feeling the familiar ache of disappointment settle beside the sharper edge of resolve. Later that evening, Daniel called to confirm the date of the buyer's walkthrough, his tone brisk and efficient, as though we were colleagues coordinating a project rather than family navigating the dismantling of shared history. I assured him I would be ready. The truth once again was layered. Ready did not mean what he believed it meant. I began spending more time outside despite the deepening cold, walking the property line with gloved hands tucked into my coat pockets, counting steps the way Thomas had taught me decades ago when we first learned the boundaries of what we owned. The land stretched quiet and patient under a thin blanket of snow, its contours softened but not erased. I paused often, listening to the distant rush of highway traffic and the whisper of wind through bare branches, reminding myself that permanence rarely announces itself with grand gestures. It reveals itself in endurance. One afternoon I drove to a small law office 2 towns over, a place Thomas had once mentioned when discussing contingency plans I had never imagined needing. The attorney, a woman named Helen Carter with steady gray eyes and a voice that carried both kindness and steel, reviewed the documents I had gathered without interruption. When she finally spoke, her words were measured and precise. The residence sale was valid. The land trust remained fully intact. Any attempt by the new owners to alter the property without my written consent could be challenged immediately. I thanked her and scheduled a follow-up meeting, feeling the quiet architecture of a counter move begin to take shape around me. On the drive home, the sky darkened early, winter daylight slipping away before most people had finished their errands, and for the first time since that Thanksgiving dinner I allowed myself to imagine not just survival but reclamation. The house lights glowed warmly when I turned into the driveway, their familiar welcome unchanged, and I realized that appearances like ownership can be deceiving. Inside, I continued packing what they expected me to pack, leaving behind what they would never think to question. They believed I was preparing to leave. In truth, I was preparing to stay in a way none of them could yet understand. The week before the scheduled walkthrough arrived with a brittle kind of cold that made even familiar routines feel staged, and I found myself moving through the house with an awareness that every action now carried intention, every gesture another line in a story they believed they had already finished. The boxes near the front door had multiplied just enough to appear convincing, their flaps loosely taped as though I had grown tired of organizing my own departure. Rebecca texted twice to ask if I needed help with packing. I thanked her and declined, picturing the slight crease of irritation that would appear between her eyebrows when control slipped even a fraction beyond her reach. That small victory warmed me more than the heater humming along the baseboards. In the afternoons, I continued my walks along the snow-dusted edge of the property, the horizon wide and silent except for the distant cry of crows cutting through the gray sky. I counted fence posts. I memorized the shallow dip near the old oak tree where spring rain always gathered. Ownership, I was beginning to understand, was not simply a matter of signatures but of attention, of knowing where the ground rose and fell beneath your feet. One evening Daniel stopped by unexpectedly, his coat still smelling faintly of city air and new leather, and for a moment I glimpsed the boy he had been, standing awkwardly in the doorway as though uncertain how to enter a life he had already decided to rearrange. He asked whether I had secured a lease for the apartment Rebecca had recommended. I told him I was exploring options. He nodded, relieved by the compliance he thought he heard. We sat at the dining table with mugs of tea cooling between us, both aware of the invisible architecture of distance that had grown over years neither of us had fully examined. He spoke about market forecasts and school districts, and the opportunities that would come once renovations were complete. I listened without interruption, letting his plans fill the room like a future that did not yet recognize its own limitations. Before leaving, he glanced toward the hallway where the open boxes waited, and I watched gratitude flicker across his face. It was the gratitude of someone who believed a difficult task was being handled without his involvement. After he drove away, I closed the front door gently and leaned my forehead against the cool wood. allowing myself a brief moment of sorrow for what had been lost long before any contracts were signed. Then I straightened and returned to the study where Helen Carter notes lay beside Thomas' journals, the two sources of guidance forming a quiet alliance across time. Together they outlined the path ahead with unmistakable clarity. The new owners would arrive believing they had purchased both structure and destiny. Rebecca would imagine design boards and contractor meetings unfolding without resistance. Daniel would continue measuring success in square footage and rising equity. And I would be there, not as an obstacle but as a fact they had failed to calculate. On the morning of the walk-through I rose before dawn once more, dressing carefully in a navy wool suit I had not worn since Thomas' memorial service, fastening the pearl brooch he had given me on our 30th anniversary. Snow had stopped overnight, leaving the world washed clean and deceptively calm. I placed the land trust documents into a slim leather portfolio and set it beside the front door, directly in line with the boxes that suggested departure. The clock chimed 6 measured notes. Outside, headlights swept briefly across the curtains as the first car of the day passed on the road. I stood in the quiet hallway and understood with absolute certainty that everything was now in place. They believed this visit would confirm my absence. Instead it would mark the beginning of their education. The buyers arrived precisely at 10 o'clock that morning, their car tires crunching softly over the thin crust of snow as though the world itself were clearing a path for what they believed would be a simple inspection of their future. I watched them through the lace curtain in the front hallway, noting the eagerness in their posture, the way the young woman pointed toward the roofline while the man checked something on his phone, already imagining improvements he had not yet earned the right to make. Daniel and Rebecca pulled into the driveway moments later, stepping out with expressions carefully arranged somewhere between professionalism and impatience. I opened the door before they could knock, greeting them with a calmness that seemed to surprise everyone but me. The leather portfolio rested lightly against my side, its presence as steady as a second heartbeat. We moved through the house together in a slow procession that felt almost ceremonial, the agent describing square footage and natural light, while Rebecca nodded enthusiastically at each mention of potential upgrades. She spoke of open concepts and modern finishes, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who believed decisions had already been finalized. I allowed her to lead them into the kitchen, into the living room, up the staircase Thomas had sanded by hand more than once, each step echoing with memories that now felt less like losses and more like witnesses. When we reached the back door the young couple paused to admire the stretch of land beyond the fence, the winter sunlight breaking through the clouds just long enough to illuminate the gentle slope toward the tree line. "We are thinking of adding a deck here," the man said, gesturing confidently across ground he did not yet understand. Rebecca smiled as though the suggestion confirmed her own vision. That was when I spoke. My voice was soft but carried with unmistakable clarity, the kind that comes from years of being overlooked until the moment you decide not to be. I explained that while the residence had indeed been sold, the land itself remained under a separate trust established by my late husband, a trust requiring my written consent for any structural changes, subdivision, or long-term use. For a heartbeat no one moved. The wind stirred dry leaves along the edge of the yard. Somewhere a distant truck shifted gears on the highway. Daniel looked at me with an expression I had not seen since he was a child caught between guilt and disbelief. Rebecca opened her mouth as though searching for a response that would restore the certainty she had worn like armor. The agent asked quietly to review the documents. I handed him the portfolio with the same measured composure I had practiced for weeks, watching realization dawn across faces that had expected only compliance. The young buyers exchanged uncertain glances, their imagined renovations dissolving into questions about timelines and permissions. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse or explain. I simply stood there on land that still recognized my authority, feeling the long arc of Thomas' foresight settle into place around me. Daniel began to speak, then stopped, the future he had constructed shifting beneath his feet in ways he had never anticipated. Rebecca stared out toward the frozen field as though searching for a boundary she could cross without consequence. I let the silence extend until it became its own answer. They had believed ownership could be arranged like furniture, moved and polished until it fit their design. Now they were learning that some foundations refused to be relocated. When the meeting ended the buyers left with polite uncertainty, the agent promising to clarify next steps. and Daniel lingered in the doorway as though hoping for instructions I no longer needed to give. I closed the door gently behind him and stood alone in the hallway, sunlight stretching across the floorboards in a quiet declaration that nothing essential had truly been taken. They had sold the house. The ground beneath their plan still belonged to me.